Well, everybody, it's really a pleasure. It's a bittersweet pleasure for me to introduce Stefan Lafortune today, being one of the maybe two or three people in the room that remembers when we hired him. It's bittersweet because he's retiring, and anyway, it's been a long, strange trip, Stefan.
Yeah.
He asked me not to talk about him because he's going to talk about himself. So.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Can everyone hear me fine with the microphone? Okay, good. It's great to see so many of you here today, actually. Jim forgot the word emeritus. It's not that I am retiring. I am actually retired as of December 31st. But I think until tonight, it hasn't quite felt like retirement. So anyway, it's a pleasure to see you today. If you read the abstract, which I don't know if you did, but I want to actually teach you a few definitions in discrete event systems. But that's a way for me to tell you a few stories about my career. A large emphasis on the beginning and the end, a couple of connecting dots in the middle. And I want to save 10 minutes at the end for personal remarks. So we'll have but this clock is wrong, by the way, by 3 minutes. So, okay. Just to set the stage for the technical part of this talk, I'll be talking about discrete event systems. So no big surprise, but if you're not familiar with that area, we're talking about dynamic systems where the state space is a discrete set and the transitions are event-driven as opposed to time-driven. That is, events occur over time. And it's a useful model for generic problems of information. And so when we describe the behavior of the system, we talk about sequences of events, also called strings, also called runs. And when we look at everything that a system can do, we have a set of these strings. And that set, we call it a language. So whenever I say the word language in this talk, I mean a set. And the elements of that set are strings of events. And the way that these languages are represented, because they're typically infinite cardinality, is using finite state automata, which are, think of it as a directed graph. Your nodes are your states. Directed arcs between states are labeled by events. So the strings that the automaton can generate is a language. You can also use label transition systems, similar terminology. So in this talk, I will be no time explicitly and no stochastics, just the logical evolution of systems. But at first, I want to tell you about three people who I wouldn't be here without them today. So the first one is Michael Polis. He was one of my professors when I was an undergraduate student in Montreal at the engineering school of the University of Montreal. That's called the École Polytechnique. And he gave me my first summer job to program a PDP-11 computer in his lab. And then he encouraged me to go to grad school. And I was a little hesitant to come to the United States, although we talked about it. So I went to the other side of the mountain in Montreal, that's called Mount Royal. École Polytechnique is on one side. On the other side is McGill University, and where the language of instruction was English. So my first experience to go to a school in English. And it turns out they had hired Peter Keynes. And I connected immediately with him. And I did my master's degree with Peter Keynes, working on stochastic adaptive control. So he really taught me how to do research. And as much as I liked it, I told Peter, you're great, but I think I'm ready to go to the United States for my PhD. So he said, well, you should go to Berkeley and connect with Eugene Wang or Gene Wang. So I followed his advice. I went to Berkeley, I submitted. I became Gene Wang's student. And then in 1986, the year I graduated, there were lots of jobs on the market. So I was looking in Spectrum where I should apply. And Gene Wang told me, you should apply to Michigan. It's a good school. So I applied, interviewed here in April of 1986, got the job offer, and spent my entire career here. So sadly, Michael Polis died in March 2024. So then I was doing my PhD at Berkeley. And I was working on stochastic control with decentralized information. And it was too hard for me. I wasn't making any progress. So one day, Gene Wang, in our weekly meeting, he says, why don't you look at the concurrency control problem in database systems? I didn't know anything about database systems, so I didn't know what concurrency control was. So I asked him, what is the concurrency control problem? Can you explain it to me? And he did. So I'm going to try to explain it to you briefly. So when users read and write on a database, their actions are usually grouped into transactions. Like, for example, you're transferring money from your checking account to your savings account. So there's a series of sequence of read and write operations. So when multiple transactions get executed at the same time on a database, their reads and their writes get interleaved. So you might have issues of reading data that's not fully updated or overwriting data. So you can get incorrect executions. So the viewpoint is that each transaction in isolation is fine. So any serial execution of them is fine. So you should only allow interleavings that produce the same result as a serial execution. And the criterion for that is called conflict serializability, the correctness criterion for these interleavings. So basically, the problem is between a read and a write or two writes. So those are your events here, right? Talking about discrete events. So if the reads and the writes between transactions are all consistently ordered, so there's no circularity. So if it forms a partial order, then it's consistent with a serial order, which is what you want. So that's the correctness criteria. So the way that people ensure that the execution will satisfy serializability is by using a mechanism called locking. So you acquire an exclusive lock on the data object, so you're the only one transaction can read or write until it's done, until it releases the lock. But when you have locking, you might have the phenomenon of deadlock. That is, I have a lock on an object, Pete has a lock on another object, I need to acquire a lock on the object that he's holding and vice versa. So I'm waiting for Pete, Pete's waiting for me. We are in a deadlock, nothing happens. That's when your computer freezes, right? So in those days, I started reading about that. Nowadays, we would say, oh, we have a control problem for a discrete event systems. We're looking at the interleaving these reads and these writes. Those are your events and your state trajectories. The ones that are incorrect are the ones that violate conflict serializability. And we want to do the control to avoid or minimize deadlock, which is a liveness property. So you can think of conflict serializability in today's terminology, we would say it's a safety property on that dynamic system. Of course, I didn't know anything about that because these concepts had not been invented then. So I'm working on that. And then I call that uncontrollable event. I go to the CDC, there's a conference on decision and control in 1984 while I was a grad student. And I met Peter Ramage. Now, in my master's thesis at McGill, I had worked on a paper that Peter Ramage had published, which is a very famous paper on adaptive control, okay, for this deterministic and stochastic systems. So I was really eager to meet him. And he tells me, well, he went to Toronto for his PhD, and then he worked with Murray Wanham, and he said, I did something completely different. Murray Wanham wanted to work on discrete event systems and supervisory control. So that's what Peter developed in his PhD thesis. So I go to his seminar, and the title is on the supremo controllable sublanguage of a given language. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't understand anything at the seminar. So I opened the proceedings, because in those days, you registered at a conference, you got the hard copy proceedings. I start reading, I still don't understand anything. So, okay. But then I realized over the next couple of years that what he was trying to do was relevant to what I had done on concurrency control. So when I came to Michigan, I sat down, and one of the first things I did was to work on understanding the two major papers that Peter Ramage and Murray Wanham published in 1987. But the work had started way back in the early 80s. These were the actual hard copy reprints that actually went into the recycling when I vacated my office in December. That was really difficult to but there's only so many things you can keep. So, and that led to, so I realized that the concurrency control problem that I had worked on could actually be recast into their theory to explain better the problem and as well to give you insight about how to extend the theory. So that was my first discrete event systems paper in the Transactions on Automatic Control. You can probably read, it's May 1988. So I should tell you a few words about that theory because it's relevant for the entire seminar. So we're talking about doing feedback control in the usual way. You have a system that generates trajectories. You have sensors. You have a controller that's controlling actuators that change the behavior of the system. But in that theory, you're trying to restrict the behavior of the system according to a safety property, like conflict serializability. Remove the strings of events that violate your safety property. And you would like to avoid deadlock, another criterion. But in general, you have limited sensing. That is, you don't see all the events that the system will generate. And you have limited actuation. Some events, you cannot prevent them from happening. They're not controllable. So the safety specification will usually be expressed as another regular language. Or you could also express it in linear temporal logic and then transform that into an automaton. The underlying data structure is always an automaton, okay? So I say S for supervisor because it prevents bad behavior from happening. It doesn't force behavior. So that's why we call it supervisor as opposed to controller. So here's definition number 2 for you today. What Ramage and Wanham discovered was that in order for this feedback loop to achieve exactly a given specification, you must have conditions on that specifications. And they're called controllability and observability in that theory. So the controllability condition mathematically is written like this, but I'm not going to try to explain the notation to you if you're not familiar. Basically, it says that the boundary between the legal and illegal behaviors must be crossed by controllable events only. Because if you cross the boundary by an uncontrollable event, then you cannot force that boundary or adhere to it, right? So you must prevent things in advance. So if you cannot prevent it, then it must be legal. There's a way to paraphrase the controllability condition. And this condition actually has very nice algebraic properties, and that's where that supremal controllable sublanguage that I mentioned earlier, emerges from these notions. You can try to find subsets so that you are controllable and do as best as you can. Because when you're trying to control a system, you can be safe by turning the system off. It's not going to do anything, but then that's not very useful. So you want to achieve as much behavior as possible that is legal, and if you can, avoid deadlock. There's another thing you want to avoid. It's not just that it freezes, you avoid live locks. Live locks is when you're going into a circle, if you wish, into some sort of cycle, and you cannot get out of it to go to a desired state. So these notions are usually expressed in terms of some goal state that you're trying to reach, okay? So an example for a live lock is if you keep submitting the same proposal to different funding agencies and it keeps getting rejected. So it's an indication you write a new proposal, right? So your supervisor should be non-blocking if possible. The second key property, which is mathematically a little bit more complicated to write, but I'll give you the intuition. So I told you that you have only limited sensing in general. So you must estimate the true state of the system based on your observations so that you can make the right control decision, okay? So think of this, the sensing is either there's non-determinism in the system or there are events that are not captured because you don't have sensors for that. So if you're measuring temperature or velocity and estimate, you're measuring, you have a number, so the estimate of a number will be a number. But when you're estimating a discrete set, a state in a discrete set, you don't have numbers, so your estimate will be a state, will be a set, sorry, not a state, a set of possible states. So you will not be sure if the system is in state 1, 2, or 3, for example. So observability is saying that you look at all your state estimate, all the states in there, and if they require conflicting actions, if in one case you must enable an event, but in another state that looks the same, you must disable the event, then you have a control conflict. In other words, you don't have enough information to issue the right control action. So observability mathematically says this should not happen. So the supervisor will always know the right control decision at any given time. So it's a strong condition, but it's based on the observable events, okay? So I learned these concepts. We're still in the early 1990s. I told you there was an emphasis on the beginning and then the end. So I'm having fun with several PhD students. And then I go to another conference, the American Control Conference in 1991. And it's Friday afternoon. The conference is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It's 6 p.m. I was chairing the last session. People, you've been to ACC, from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And then there's the closing reception, right? So I'm ready to leave the room. It's 6:05, and this gentleman comes to me and he says, "Hi, my name is Qasim Sinamuhidin." And he gives me his business card so that I can actually read his last name. And to make a long story short, Qasim, actually, sadly, he passed away about a year ago. So Qasim was a researcher at Johnson Controls, and he was working on heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, or HVAC systems. And he was trying to detect fault, like a valve is stuck, or a controller failed on, or a controller failed off, or a pump has failed. And in these components are buried in the ceilings and the walls of the buildings. And at that time, they were not sensor rich. So he says, I needed that good mechanism to detect these faults. And he had worked on this, and he told me, I know that this should be done with a discrete event systems approach, and I have a lot of examples, but I don't know how to formalize that. So great for us, his company believed in what he was trying to do. They told him, you can go to Michigan and spend a year, so a sabbatical from his research position. And he arrives here in September of 1992. And I had at the time 2 PhD students who were interested in that topic. That's Meera Sampath and Raja Sengupta. And I went to my colleague next door, Dimos Tenekezis, and I say, Dimos, we're going to start a project on fault diagnosis for HVAC system. Would you like to join? And he said, sure. And we also benefited from work that Feng Lin, who was a faculty member at Wayne State University, hired by Michael Polis, who was my professor at École Polytechnique, who left École Polytechnique to become chair of ECE at Wayne State University, and he hired Feng Lin. And Feng Lin and I have been collaborators ever since. So Feng Lin had spent a summer internship at Ford, and he had thought about these problems of how to do fault diagnosis. So to make a long story short, in those years, the group, we developed a theory for how to do diagnosis of unobservable events in discrete event systems. And it started with a definition, because I told you the emphasis of this talk is definition, a definition that we call diagnosability. And once we had the right definition, then Meera Sampath took it from there, it became her PhD thesis topic. She formalized and created this construct called a diagnoser automaton, which is used to verify that property, as well as doing diagnosis online. Meera won Rackham Distinguished Dissertation Award that year. It was not called ProQuest yet. And we had a couple of papers, one in automatic control and one on control systems technology, which was a relatively new journal at the time. And we also created our first software tool at the time. So these are the 2 papers that we produced that have been cited a fair amount. And I also put paper by Feng Lin because he was the first who really thought about diagnosability for discrete event system. Of course, it was not a new topic in general for dynamic systems. So let me give you the definition. So the context here is we don't have a feedback loop. We have a system that's partially observed because not all sensors, the sensors don't capture all of the events in the system. So we have a set of unobservable events. So, and including a fault is not immediately observable, only its effect, right? So we're trying to reason about that. We want to build an diagnostic engine that will tell you yes, I know that the fault has occurred in the past. No, I know for sure that the fault did not occur, or uncertain, it might have occurred, but I don't have enough information to say for sure. So the definition that we came up with is that, and in words, is here. So an event is diagnosable if after every occurrence of that event, if you make more observations after a certain amount of additional observations, you will be sure that that event occurred in the past. So if you keep observing the system, now we're talking about faults that don't destroy the system. The system is still operating, but in a degraded mode. So what we're saying is the degraded mode of operation eventually will look different than the normal mode of operations. You'll be able to reason based on your model that's something that you did not see happen in the past. Okay, so it's model-based inferencing about occurrences in the past. So this is how the definition was written mathematically in our first paper, but I simplified it. I just want to emphasize the use of the quantifiers here. They're very important. So what it's saying is there exists an integer. So that's your bound for your detection delay, if you wish. And then it's for all quantifiers. So for all strings of events that end with a fault event, and for all their continuations, eventually you will know that the event of interest occurred in the past. That's what line 4 says. That's just, I don't need to introduce that notation, okay? So the intuition's enough for today. So, but remember, so if you're trying to prove that, you're trying to find a counterexample. So you have it, there exists n. What's the counterexample? What's the negation? It's for all. So the verification of diagnosability boils down to verifying a certain type of cycle in this automaton that Mira Sampath invented called diagnoser automaton. So it's a cycle detection, which is something that's not too difficult to do once you build that automaton. So I'm very proud of this work because the community and really built on it. There's been a gazillion extensions for all sorts of scenarios, but always boil down to us writing that definition of diagnosability after several iterations on the blackboard in 4122 upstairs. So it started at Michigan. And then, so I'm having fun with that, of course. And then I say another observable event. So I visit my friends in INRIA in Rennes, and I'm not sure of the year, but I think it's 2004. And Hervé Marchand is a collaborator of mine. He's working with his colleague Philippe Darondeau and their student Jérémy Dubreuil, and they tell me, hey, Stéphane, there's this guy in computer science, Laurent Mazaré, who wrote a definition for a computer security property. It's called opacity. And it's sort of the negation of diagnosability, but not quite. It's a way to capture security properties, and it's a way to capture that you keep something secret to an eavesdropper. And they explained that to me, and it's really interesting. So let me explain it to you. So again, it's the same idea. You have a system generating sequences of events. Think state-based now, it's easier that way. There is an eavesdropper, and they know the model, but of course it's partial observation, so it's non-deterministic. So they're trying to reason. So they're trying to determine, are you in a particular state of interest that we call a secret state? So is the system in a secret state or not? So that's called current state opacity. So you can have variations such as what was the initial state of the system, or did the system visit a certain state k steps ago? But the CSO version, current state, is the simplest one to describe. So what you're trying to achieve here is basically, if you're the system, you're trying to verify, is my secret going to be opaque to that external observer, which may not be friendly, right? So it's an eavesdropper. So the way to think of it is that you're going to be opaque if that eavesdropper is never going to be sure that you are in a secret state. So you have to have deniability, call that plausible deniability, right? So there are no probabilities here, but you can put probabilistic framework on that if you'd like, but here we're studying it at a logical level. As long as there is another explanation for what the eavesdropper sees that is observationally equivalent to what's happened, and that doesn't lead to a secret state, then the eavesdropper will never be sure that the system is in a secret state. So that's what opacity is. This is the definition in math. I want to show you the quantifiers because they're a little bit different here. It's a for all there exists. So for all strings that go to a secret state, there must exist another string that is observationally equivalent, and it doesn't go to a secret state. So it's for all there exists. So if you want to find a counterexample, you have a there exists for all, right? So, and you can test that using a technique called determinizing the system model, which is non-deterministic because of the unobservable events. It's called the observer automaton. So that's a standard thing. So current state opacity is easy to verify once you build that test. So so this got a lot of excitement in the discrete event systems community. And people ask, oh, what can we do if opacity doesn't hold? So first you check opacity. So you can do control, right? So you can do feedback control. That's the feedback control loop that Ravage and Wanham introduced. So I'm controlling the system to remove the strings that reveal the secret. So I was watching that, and then I had a new PhD student, Yi-Chin Wu, and we decided to look at opacity and its enforcement. And then I didn't like the idea of restricting the behavior of the system because maybe you cannot do that, right? The system is doing things, you're just trying to hide a secret. And then we read a paper by Schneider on edit automata, and that gave us an idea. How about we insert fictitious events in the output of at the output of the system, and to modify the behavior so that with these fictitious events, the intruder will not be able to detect the secret. Okay, so you're enforcing opacity by adding fictitious events. So I'm not adding noise here. At the time, differential privacy was an area that was emerging, but we're not adding noise because we're not dealing with numbers, right? We're dealing with strings, and we don't want the intruder to know that they're getting fooled. So we want to insert events so that it still looks like genuine system behavior, but it doesn't lead to a secret state, okay? So it's an enforcement of opacity in a way that the intruder will not know about it. So here we assume that the inserted events and the genuine ones are indistinguishable from the point of view of the intruder. It's possible that a legitimate recipient, maybe you can think of a way to let them know which events are fake and which events are genuine. So what Yi-Chin Wu did in her PhD dissertation was to synthesize this insertion function as an input-output automaton, or what we call a transducer. So how to build it, given a secrecy specification, how to build that. So she developed an algorithm for synthesizing this. And she also won a dissertation award. This one is actually was called ProQuest at the time. And then, so here we were only inserting events. Then we decided to say, what about if we delete events? Now this is a little bit more tricky because we could delete everything. So you have to put limitations on deletions. So this was the PhD thesis of the student after Yiding Ji. So we looked at the time at applications. So we had the location-based services. So the context was a mobility model, and then you're trying to hide your exact location for a particular state in your mobility model. So we actually developed an app that was on an iPad that was working in real time to do obfuscation. So we're pretty happy about that. And we also looked at contact tracing apps because that's when the pandemic hit, right? How to keep privacy. And then with Nejmiye Oze, we recruited a student, Andrew Wintenberg. And he says, yeah, but your work is incomplete. What about the legitimate recipients? They're seeing altered outputs, right? With the edit function or insertion function. So we still want to send them useful information, which we had addressed by limiting the amount of obfuscation that we would do in the original setup. So Andrew wanted to go beyond that. So he said, well, we're going to add this obfuscator for the unintended recipients, but we need, so this example was, let's say we're tracking people moving in a smart office, there's sensors everywhere, and we want to hide visits to a particular room for certain observers, but we would still like the emergency service to know, where we are or something like that, okay? So we need to provide them additional information. So here we say a key, but it's not a key in the cryptographic sense. It's we need to give extra information to the intended recipients so that they can sort of undo the obfuscation and extract what they need to know for whatever their goal is. So in addition to the privacy objective, which is to hide secrets from the unintended recipient, we have a utility objective for the intended recipients, and we want to give them extra information. So Andrew figured out how to solve that problem. Doing good on time here. And he realized that what we have here is what's called a pipeline architecture. So I have the system generating observations. I'm synthesizing the obfuscator as a transducer that will insert fictitious events or delete some events. And then this is the information transmitted over the network. Now for my intended recipient, I'm going to provide them another transducer that will undo the effect of the obfuscator to the extent needed as specified by the utility specification for the intended recipients. So this is called a distributed synthesis problem, as they call it in the informal methods in reactive synthesis. And in the discrete event systems side of things, people have not looked at that architecture, but thankfully they have in the people in formal methods in computer science. And this architecture is decidable, which is good. It's not always true for distributed synthesis. So if you're familiar with that, privacy and utility here are omega regular properties. That's why you can solve. If you're not familiar with that terminology, it doesn't matter. So what matters here is I can give you a system. I can give you a privacy specification for the unintended recipients, and I can give you a utility specification for the intended recipients. And then Andrew's algorithm will synthesize for you the obfuscator and the what we call the inference function. So that was very nice. And then Andrew thought, well, I can do even more. I can do even more because maybe I can also synthesize a controller for the plant if there's a control specification. So in addition to the obfuscation and to the inference function, you can synthesize a controller if you have a control specification in that problem. And then he did a couple more architectures. I'll just talk about the one at the top. He said, we could even have a remote controller that's going to work on obfuscated data. So that's really interesting. So you're going to obfuscate the outputs of the plant. That's what gets transmitted over the network. So it's not visible to the eavesdropper. The controller will work on that obfuscated data and produce control actions that will then be decoded, and that's what will be applied at the plant. So then we synthesize these blocks in blue here, the obfuscator, the controller, and the decoder. And we know how to do that. Of course, the crank has to go for a while because these problems have high computational complexity, right, as you might expect. So if you know anything about homomorphic encryption, that reminds me of that, but we're not doing encryption here. We're just doing transducers, so input-output automata. So that's very nice work, which I'm very proud of. Andrew did great work, as all of my PhD students did. And this is, this is my penultimate CAC paper because it was published in October, and it summarizes these two architectures that I described to you for obfuscation. Okay.
And you don't have a hard copy of that one, Stefan?
No, no hard copies.
Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. I'll get a sip of water also. Okay. So we've seen a few definitions and their context. I have one more definition for you. And actually two more. So a lot of our research in the last 4 decades, but maybe after I started in discrete event systems, I've been focused on architectures with decentralized information. So before I had one supervisor controlling. Now imagine 2 supervisors working as a team to control one plant but they have different observations. So different observable events report to the different supervisors. And then they issue their control actions, and these control actions get fused in some way to control the system, okay? So if you remember that towards the beginning, I talked about the property of observability. So the supervisor has enough information to issue unambiguous control actions, okay? Here, it has to be a joint property of observability. So the definition, and I won't show you any equations for that, is co-observability. So co for cooperative, not for complement, is that the two supervisors together can control the plant. So one of the two will always know what to do, okay? So hopefully that's a situation when you have, two parents with children, right? They have different observations, they have different methods of actuation, but cooperatively, one of them always knows what to do. So people studied these in great detail over the years. The properties are well understood. What's difficult is what to do if the property is not satisfied. So there's a lot of issues with that. So one of my PhD students, about 10 years ago, that was Xiang Yin, he said we should look at an alternative architecture as opposed to issuing control decisions and trying to fuse them in some clever way. Think conjunction and disjunction. Why don't we send state estimates? Because all of these supervisors are making observations of the same system. So they can send their state estimates, which are sets, remember, and you just take their intersection. That's how you deal with to figure out to get a better estimate. So this was this architecture here, which we had done something like that in diagnosis with Demos and our PhD student, Rami Debouk, way before that, but only for diagnosis, not for control. So here in this architecture, you have one plant observed by, say, N agents. They each build their own estimate of the plant based on their observations. That gets sent to a coordinator that does the intersection of the estimate. And then you just do the best you can do based on that estimate. And that could be a control action. It could also be a diagnosis decision, or it could be estimation decision, okay? So if you're doing control, the property that was called observability at the beginning of the talk is now called SEI, co-observability, okay? Just for your information. But then uncontrollable event in 2024, I had a postdoc visiting me. So their name is Litska. It's written Ritsuka, but it's pronounced Litska. So Litska arrived in Michigan and they tell me, oh, I read your paper with Xiang Yin and I can do better than what you did. And I said, oh, really? And so Litska said, yes, you're not doing your function F as smart as you could. I said, well, we're just using these intersections of the state estimates. And then you look, and if there's a conflict, then we have to do the most conservative decision if we're doing control. And Litska said, I can compute a function F that's better. This is computed offline, right? This should be a lookup table at real time because you're sending state estimates to an actuator, let's say. The actuator just look up in a table for that state estimate. I enable the event or I disable the event, right? So Litska figured out how to compute the best possible function F. Now, this is a little more difficult to explain intuitively. So I'm going to keep it simple here. And what Litska did is the following. When you create a state estimate by intersection, you have to decide if there is unambiguity in the decision. So namely, you know exactly what the control action should be, or if there's ambiguity. But if there's ambiguity, there could be two types. So that was the creative thing that Litska arrived at. There could be essential ambiguity, or the ambiguity can only be apparent. Namely, it can be resolved if you compute your function F in a smart way beforehand. So I'm telling you, this is the last definition for today, essential ambiguity. And I'm not going to try to go deeper into that, just to say that going back to this picture, what Litska figured out is how to resolve those intersections in the best possible way by an original construction, which involves combining the plant state with these, all of the state estimates, taking the parallel composition, all of that, and then being able to squeeze all of the information you can and get the best possible F, which is still a lookup table, as I said a moment ago. And the key for that is a definition of essential ambiguity. Okay. So this is the last paper, which has not yet appeared, but it's online. It's supposed to appear in March. And you will notice the use of the word universal in the title, which I was quite hesitant to use. But Litska said, no, it is universal because I have computed the best possible function F that you can. And because of the definition of essential ambiguity, Litska is correct. And the reviewers asked the same question. Are you sure you want to put the word universal? We wrote the explanation and they said, okay. So it's kind of weird. The last paper will have the word universal in it. So that's almost my 40 minutes for my technical part. So what I want you to remember today is that in these problems, the information structure is very important. The control architecture is very important. Having the right theory, of course, is essential, but the right theory will be based on the right definition. And sometimes you don't know what the right definitions will be until years later after you've done more work on the problem. Okay. So now with the, looking back, I can say that yes, controllability, that was Ramage and Wanham. Observability, I forgot to give you credit to that. It was Feng Lin and Barry Wanham. Feng Lin did his PhD at Toronto after Peter Ramage, and then he went to Wayne State University. And then diagnosability was from here, and opacity from the French researcher Laurent Mazary. So these definitions, I consider them to be the right ones because they are generic. You can pose so many problems that they guide you on how to approach these problems. I don't want to forget the idea that you should avoid deadlock and live lock, and you should be as permissive as possible as well, and that computation matters. These discrete event systems problems are notoriously difficult because of the computational complexity, so you want to exploit system structure if you can, but that would be another seminar, not today. At the very least, you want to know what the boundary is between decidability and undecidability, right? If you know what that means. So now I want to talk about the people. So this is the most important slide of this presentation. This is all my 24 PhD students, 3 of whom I co-advise with Dimos Nekezis, 1 with Don Tilbury, and the last one, Andrew, with Nejmiye Ozai. So as I said, I focused on the beginning of my career and the 2 papers at the end with a couple of connecting dots. So they all did great work. And actually, more importantly, they all went on to very successful careers, and I'm super proud of what they've accomplished. So in academia, industry, national labs, and startup companies. And I have an academic grandson here in the room too. So over the years, we were fortunate to host many visitors here at Michigan for long-term visits, typically 1 year. Students, PhD students elsewhere, postdocs, faculty on sabbatical, industrial researchers on sabbaticals who have listed names of people that all their work, the collaborative work has resulted in publications. And hopefully I did not forget anyone, but I do want to, for the record, to show you all these names. I also want to add more names here. So the left column are people I've really actively collaborated with over the years. I mentioned Feng Lin many times in this talk. I've written more papers with him than anyone else. Of course, my colleague Dimos Nekezis, because we co-supervised 3 students together, and he was always a sounding board for me and taught me a lot. Karen Rudy, who was a frequent visitor at Michigan, she's at Queen's University. Christos Kassandras called me one day and he said, do you want to join me in my book project for Introduction to Discrete Event Systems as a co-author? And the best decision I ever did was to say yes. So And in the right column, I want to mention people who have inspired me or given me, mentored me, or I've had so many technical discussions with them over the years. I actually did not author papers with them, but these are sort of my giants, quote unquote. We lost Praveen Vara and Murray Wanham in the last few years, sadly. So, and of course, I don't want to forget Harris McClamrock, who is here. I hold a collegiate professorship named after Harris. That's because I picked the name, right? And to my very pleasant surprise, I found out that even in retirement, I can keep the name professorship with the word emeritus added to it. So, okay, I have you guys as a captive audience. So I'm going to give you unsolicited advice. Okay. So this is really related to academic career. So I'm talking to the students in the room and maybe the junior faculty, but to anyone. So I have 10 observations to make, okay? So number one is advice I got from Gene Wong when I was about to leave Berkeley and come to Ann Arbor, and he said, set your own standards and follow them. So that's really good advice. I will add to that, when you set your standards, make sure you judiciously select your role models. Number two is we stand on the shoulders of giants. So find out who the giants are in the field of interest and then study their work. Because there's just too many papers, right? You just can't read everything. So if you read the work of the giants, you won't go wrong. And if you don't know who the giants are in your field, then ask your PhD advisor. And because we're at Michigan, they may be a giant themselves, right? This one is obvious, but needs to be said. Learn from your collaborators and your students. This I heard at a database conference early in my career. Denis Tsipritsis was giving similar type of advice. I forgot most of what he said, but I remember the develop infrastructure. And I would say whatever infrastructure means for you, it could be a lab, it could be a software infrastructure. But so in other words, think long-term. Talk to problem domain experts, very important. But sometimes you need to figure things out on your own. I think I'm still okay on time. I will just say one thing here. I told you at the beginning of the talk that Gene Wong said, why don't you look at concurrency control? And I asked him, well, can you explain to me what concurrency control is? And he did. So later on in my PhD studies, I needed another problem to work on. He said, why don't you look at query optimization in database systems? I said, well, can you explain to me what query optimization is? And he said, no. He said, I won't always be here. You got to go figure it out on your own. So, okay. So I left his office and started to figure out what query optimization was. All right, this one's obvious. Despite what your parents might have told you, talk to strangers at conferences. Speaking of conferences, I would say over-prepare all of your conference presentations and try to leave time for questions. So two observations here. It's like professional sports. People remember your bad performances more often than they remember your good performances. So don't ever give a bad conference talk. And don't do what I'm doing today, which is use all the time, because leave time for questions. So do as I say, don't do as I do, because people are smart and people can ask good questions and you may get inspiration from them. That's hard. That hurts, right? They're wrong most of the time, but not always. Write a book or a textbook. It's good for you because it will force you to organize your thoughts, and it's good for the community, especially if you write a textbook. Okay, the last one, I'll hide it. The last one is a conversation I had with Murat Arçak at a Dagstuhl workshop. Don't you know what that is? That was just before the pandemic, and he was working on traffic control, and I said, oh, I worked on traffic control many years ago, and then we said, yeah, things get reinvented all the time. But the way he phrased it was so good that I like to use his words. Everything gets reinvented every 25 years. So if you read papers that are 20 years old, you'll be 5 years ahead of everybody else. So I want to give you the context. So it was at that workshop. It was because it was about transportation problems. but I had worked on transportation problems. We had what was called the IVHS program at Michigan. That stands for Intelligent Vehicle Highway Systems, that were later renamed Intelligent Transportation Systems. And I had worked on control of traffic signals with my student Isaac Porsche. And Isaac was ahead of its time because he knew how to solve traffic control, but then we didn't have the connected vehicles and V2I and all the sensors that we have now in the computing power. So I hope Murat went and read Isaac Porsche's paper. Okay. In conclusion, I want to say three things. So number one, nothing happens in a void. You need the right environment at work and at home. So I want to thank the University of Michigan. It's a great institution that gave me the opportunity to have a very fascinating career. I want to thank, of course, all my colleagues, all the staff people who support our work, and all the students. There's many of you guys in the room, all the students I've interacted with over the years. And on the family side, so I come from a family of 5 children in the city of Montreal, and my parents really taught us very strong values, including the importance of education. So I'm very grateful for that. And the only one in my family who came to the United States, so they all still live in the province of Quebec. But in the US, with my wonderful wife, Michelle Gerber, we have a beautiful blended family with 4 children and 7 grandchildren. So I thank them all for their love and support. And you know that in our field, the most prestigious award is the Control Systems Award from IEEE, and it's given at the CDC every year. And because it's the most prestigious award, the recipient gets to make a speech at the award ceremony, right? So Art Krenner in 2016, I was present when he made his acceptance speech, and I thought it was a really, really good because he was talking about his career and how he was lucky to be at the right place at the right time and to meet the right people. So his message was luck matters. And when I look back at the last 4 decades, I can say that I was really lucky, incredibly lucky in my career. So I want to wish the same to all of you guys. Thank you. Yeah, I went over time by 3 minutes, by 3 minutes, but yeah.
Okay, are you gonna take questions?
I'm happy to take questions but yeah, we can take. I don't know if there might be questions online too. Is someone looking at the Zoom?
We're gonna take a look.
We can take a look. Yeah, thanks. But there's a reception after, so I'm happy to chat at the reception too, but. And if you wonder about the importance of what I talked about today, just look at the last issue of Spectrum. Now that I'm retired, I actually have time to flip through it, right? So there's this fascinating automated factory that Hyundai built for EVs, and there's so much automation, so tons of safety specifications and liveness specifications. And then they talk a lot about software faults in general or in medical devices, right? So there's tons of work left for all of you guys. Harris?
So I have a question, might give you a chance to speculate a little bit. One of the things about your career that you've seen the development of this so-called discrete event field, and it's gone from nothing up to what it is today, which is widely utilized and lots of new ideas, which you've talked about and been responsible for a lot. But could you say a little bit about what you see the future of it? Is it going to be kind of subsumed into broader concepts, or is it going to continue to develop on its own? What do you see for the future of the?
That's a tough one. I'm not really good at the vision thing, so I think it's probably going to be not subsumed, but it should work more in collaboration with other areas as opposed to standalone. I think these control problems, the discrete event part is one element of the entire control architecture. And so I think that, and it's happening a little bit in the field too, that on the one hand, you need to, this cyber physical systems, right? So you need to go, just DES is just one element of cyber physical systems. And I think you also working more closely with the computer science people in formal methods that are developing these techniques, which we did in the last part of the work that I mentioned. So, and there's an advantage to, I mean, you need a community, you need to be part of a community, and our natural home is the control system society, right? But at the same time, I think we need to broaden and look at the problems and face computational complexity. So Moshe Vardi likes to say that exponential is the new polynomial, right? Because no problem. The minute you have partial observation, you go to exponential complexity and you cannot avoid it. So, but if you look in the 19th, dynamic programming was invented in the 1950s, and look how it's used now, right? So the fundamental concept, the principle of optimality hasn't changed, right? So the fundamental concepts are going to last decades. It's the clever techniques for computation, the computational power will help you address more and more interesting
The
problems.
importance of good definitions.
Well, yeah. That was the message of my talk, right? Yes.
So, Stefan, a few years ago, I had to describe you to a colleague of mine who's working on a completely different field than you. And then I was thinking, there's this guy in electrical engineering, and, his theory is just so elegant. That was the first word came to my mind. And I think talk today was absolutely supporting that. So what's the secret? How your theory, how your research is so elegant? That's my question.
There's the answer. That's why I put that as my last slide. It's all the smart students I worked with and all the collaborators. I have to go. These guys here, well, all of them on this page. So, yeah.
So you selected them well.
Say that again?
You selected them well.
You have to, what did I say? You have to go and talk to the domain experts, right? And I mean, the research has changed, I think, because now the style is different because there's more emphasis on applications. When I started, we were all doing theory, all one, single faculty working with their own students on the 4th floor. And it's not like that anymore. And that's good too, right? Control has changed fundamentally. I remember when in the 1980s, there was an existential crisis. The control community didn't know what they were going to do after robust control. What's the future of control? They even did workshops on what's the future of control. We went to the moon, we developed a theory to go to the moon, and then we solved robust control, and then they didn't know what to do. But look what's happened to control now. So Yogi Berra said, right, it's really hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But that's my message. Herb?
So AI is everywhere.
Yes.
How has it impacted your field and conversely, the work you do having servants there?
It is starting to impact control because learning and control, it's just starting for systems with continuous systems with differential equations and continuous states. For discrete event systems, it's only starting, so I don't know what's going to happen. That's very interesting. The problem is that you don't have formal guarantees, right? So if you have formal safety guarantees, robots, AGVs should not collide on the factory floor. Robots should not collide with an obstacle. You don't want to read your bank statement to be incorrect, right? So you have to have conflict serializability 100%, not 90% or not 99%. So I don't know. That's a good point. I think that's really, next 10 years will tell us what's going to happen, but it can certainly help to make sense of the large amount of data that's produced by and try to learn system models. Because that's the challenge, is to build, so I said, we have a model, we have a model, we have a model in my talk, but we have to come up with that model, and that's really challenging. So, good question. Guys ready for non-alcoholic drinks and food?
Let's give Stefan another big round of applause.
Thank you. See you at the reception.
I'll be worried.
Okay, blessed on it, so just wanna make sure that I'm not missing any. So.